He drove into the underground parking lot with his wife and daughter. But instead of customers, they were surrounded by teenagers with knives. The man protected his family and knocked them down one by one. And at the police station, he learned the truth that changed everything. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The day had been long, and the drive back from the city center felt like the final stretch of a marathon no one wanted to run. Daniel Harper sat behind the wheel, his hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, while his eyes flicked between the road and the rearview mirror, where his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, sat strapped into her booster seat. She was humming to herself, legs swinging in rhythm, clutching a small stuffed rabbit that had accompanied her everywhere since her 3rd birthday. Beside him, Catherine adjusted her purse on her lap, flipping through messages on her phone, already planning tomorrow's errands. Their lives had become a careful choreography of routine, deliberately ordinary after years that had been anything but. The underground parking lot beneath the office complex stretched out before them as they descended the ramp. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting pale circles of light onto the concrete floor. The air was damp, filled with the smell of oil and exhaust, echoes of distant engines bouncing off the walls. Daniel parked in their assigned space, close to the elevator, always choosing the spot where he could see both the stairwell and the exit ramp. It was a habit Catherine sometimes teased him about, but tonight she said nothing. She knew the instincts that guided him were not born from superstition. They stepped out of the car, Daniel automatically scanning the surroundings. It was supposed to be a straightforward evening, just a final stop before heading home. Catherine had arranged to hand over payment for a shipment connected to her small business, and Daniel had agreed to accompany her. The contact had sounded legitimate, a polite voice on the phone, but Daniel's gut had nagged him all day. He pushed the thought aside, not wanting to ruin the calm rhythm of their family's routine. The sound came first, the scrape of shoes on concrete, too light and too hurried to belong to businessmen or janitors. From the shadows at the far end of the lot emerged a cluster of figures. At first glance, Daniel thought they were young men, but as they drew closer, the truth revealed itself. They were hardly more than boys, perhaps 15 or 16, faces partially hidden under hoodies and makeshift masks. Their movements were jittery, hands shaking as they clutched knives in an old revolver that looked stolen rather than bought. Catherine froze beside him, clutching her purse. Lily's humming stopped abruptly as she sensed the sudden shift in the air. The boys fanned out clumsily, their attempt at intimidation betrayed by their lack of coordination. One of them barked out a demand for money, his voice cracking with nervousness. Another, emboldened by the weapon in his hand, stepped closer and yanked Catherine's arm, forcing her toward him. Lily let out a startled cry as another boy pushed her away from her father, gripping her by the shoulders with more force than a child her age should ever endure. Daniel's vision narrowed, not with panic, but with the focus that had once guided him through dark corners of the world where mistakes were measured in lives lost. His breathing slowed, and time seemed to stretch. He saw the tremor in the boy's wrist holding the revolver, the hesitation in the eyes of the one holding Catherine, the uncertainty in the way the group shifted their weight. They were dangerous because they were afraid, and fear made people reckless. He calculated his odds. If he moved too soon, the gun might fire. If he waited too long, they could hurt Catherine or Lily. A sharp memory cut through his thoughts. A village in the desert where frightened boys had carried rifles taller than themselves. He had seen then what desperation did to the young, and he knew hesitation could kill. The decision came like muscle memory. He feigned compliance, raising his hand slightly, then moved with the precision of years spent in training. His first strike targeted the boy with the revolver, twisting his wrist so fast the weapon clattered to the ground. Before the others registered what was happening, Daniel pivoted, using the fallen boy's momentum to unbalance him and send him sprawling onto the concrete. The second came at him with a knife, but Daniel sidestepped, catching his arm and driving him into a pillar with such force the knife dropped harmlessly. Catherine stumbled free, clutching Lily to her chest as Daniel advanced on the remaining two. Their bravado collapsed as quickly as it had formed. One tried to swing wildly, only to be caught in a chokehold that left him gasping for air before Daniel released him, unconscious but alive. The last one backed away, eyes wide with terror, before Daniel disarmed him with a swift kick and pressed him against the hood of a nearby car until the boy ceased struggling. The echoes of the scuffle faded, replaced by the sharp sound of Lily's sobs and Catherine's attempts to soothe her. Daniel crouched, ensuring each boy was immobilized but not fatally injured. His training had taught him to eliminate threats, but something in the frightened faces staring up at him made him restrain the darker instincts. These were not hardened criminals. They were children, dangerous in their desperation, but children nonetheless. Sirens pierced the silence moments later. Someone must have called the police when the shouting began. Blue and red lights flickered at the entrance of the parking lot, painting the damp walls in fractured colors. Officers spilled into the space, weapons drawn, shouting commands. Daniel raised his hands calmly, stepping back from the subdued teenagers. He let the police take over, his pulse steady though his body thrummed with adrenaline. The officers quickly restrained the boys, handcuffing them and reading their rights. The weapons were collected, the money untouched. Catherine clung to Lily, her eyes wide with lingering fear, while Daniel gave his statement with measured words. He explained what had happened, how the boys had attacked, how he had reacted only to protect his family. The police listened, some with raised eyebrows at the efficiency with which he had subdued the group, but they asked no further questions. As the last of the boys was led away toward the waiting patrol cars, Daniel's gaze lingered on their faces. The bravado was gone, replaced by hollow fear and exhaustion. They looked more like lost children than criminals. He should have felt relief, but instead a knot of unease settled in his chest. There had been something in their eyes, something that reminded him of places he had tried for years to forget. He guided Catherine and Lily back to their car, the adrenaline fading and leaving behind the heavy silence of aftermath. Catherine leaned against him, still trembling, while Lily clutched her rabbit tighter than ever. Daniel started the engine, the hum of it filling the void where words failed them. As they drove out of the parking lot, past the flashing lights and the officers cataloging evidence, he told himself it was over. But deep inside, a voice whispered otherwise. It had not been the danger that unsettled him, nor the speed with which he had acted. It was the faces of those boys, so young and already swallowed by the darkness of the streets. He had seen soldiers their age forced into war, but this was his own city, his own country, his own daughter's world. That night, as they finally returned home and tried to settle into normalcy, Daniel lay awake long after Catherine and Lily had fallen asleep. The image of wide, frightened eyes haunted him, a reminder that the battle he thought he had left behind might not be over after all. The drive home from the parking lot should have been a release, a return to the safety of their small apartment, where Catherine would tuck Lily into bed and Daniel would prepare himself a cup of coffee to steady the remnants of adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Instead, the flashing lights of the police vehicles had followed them in his mind, trailing into the night like shadows that refused to detach. Catherine had been silent in the passenger seat, one arm wrapped protectively around Lily, whose head rested against her mother's shoulder, eyes still wide open, as if sleep could not possibly find her after what she had seen. Daniel knew the silence was not peace but shock, the heavy weight of a memory that would return again and again, if not confronted. He too was haunted, though not by fear for himself. The boys' faces, stripped of their masks, had been branded into his memory, too young, too thin, hardened only by the brittle armor of survival. The following morning, before Catherine had even spoken of breakfast or Lily had woken with her usual chatter, Daniel made the decision to return to the station. He needed to know more, and his instincts told him that the story had not ended with the police cars leaving the parking lot. Catherine raised her eyes to him with tired protest, but he kissed her gently and promised he would be back before noon. He did not tell her that the knot in his chest had only tightened overnight, that the discipline of years of service had taught him never to ignore a weight like this. The police station was a maze of noise and routine, phones ringing, typewriters clattering, officers moving with the brusque energy of people who had heard every excuse in the book. Daniel gave his name, explained that he had been involved in the incident the previous night, and was led to a small office where a weary-looking officer shuffled through paperwork. The officer read from the file with the detachment of someone for whom this was just another case. Minors, arrested for attempted robbery, possible charges pending. Daniel listened, his hands folded, his face expressionless. Then came the words that shifted everything. None of the boys had a permanent address, none had legal guardians who could be located, and none had a history beyond scraps of school records and juvenile reports. They were not hardened criminals but street children, orphans of circumstance, ghosts drifting through the city with no one to claim them. Daniel leaned back in the chair, feeling a heaviness in his chest that was more than sorrow. It was recognition. He had seen such children before, though not in this country. He remembered dusty streets in foreign villages where young boys had carried rifles too large for their shoulders, their eyes filled with the same mixture of fear and defiance. He remembered the helplessness of trying to protect villagers when the next town over had already lost all its sons to warlords. And now, here in a place that was supposed to be safe, he was confronted with the same reality. These boys had no one, and in their desperation, they had become dangerous. The officer continued to explain in matter-of-fact tones that social services would try to place them in temporary housing, though the system was overcrowded and underfunded. Most likely they would be shuffled from one shelter to another, each move stripping away another piece of trust until they either disappeared back into the streets or graduated into a life of crime. Daniel listened, but his mind had already gone elsewhere. He thought of Lily, her small hand in his as they had walked across the concrete the night before, and he thought of what it would mean if she had been born into their circumstances instead of his. That thought was unbearable, and in it lay the seed of a decision that would change his life. When he returned home, Catherine saw the storm in his expression before he spoke. She listened as he explained what he had learned, her brow furrowing with worry and disbelief. She reminded him that these boys had held knives to them, that they had threatened Lily. She reminded him that they had a family to protect, that it was not his responsibility to save every broken soul in the city. Daniel did not argue. He simply sat, quiet, and let her words wash over him. She did not understand yet, and he did not know how to explain that. To walk away would be to betray the very core of who he was. He had spent years trying to bury his instincts under the weight of a normal life, but those instincts had returned the moment he saw those frightened faces. The next week was filled with hesitation and restless nights. He visited the shelter where the boys had been placed, a rundown building on the edge of the city, its paint peeling and its windows fogged with grime. Inside, the air smelled of sweat and disinfectant, a mixture of survival and neglect. The boys were there, sitting on worn couches or pacing the halls, their eyes following him with suspicion. When he first approached them, they turned away, muttering curses under their breath. They did not want his pity, did not believe in his intentions. To them, adults were either indifferent or exploitative. No one had ever stepped into their lives without wanting something in return. Daniel did not press them. He brought food, leaving it without fanfare. He fixed a broken hinge on a door, helped one of the younger boys bandage a cut, all without demanding thanks. Slowly, the hostility softened, though it did not vanish. They tested him with silence, with scorn, with defiance. He responded with patience, with the steady composure of a man who had endured interrogation and fire without breaking. He had seen worse than their anger. He knew it was a shield. At night, he returned to Catherine and Lily, who began to notice the toll it was taking. Catherine asked why he could not let it go, why he risked his own peace for strangers who had nearly destroyed theirs. He answered only that he could not see them as strangers anymore. For Lily, it was harder to understand. She asked why the boys had been so mean if they were only hungry, why they had tried to hurt her mother. Daniel held her close and told her only that people sometimes did wrong things when the world had given them no choice. She nodded as if she understood, but her wide eyes told him she was still trying to make sense of it. As the days stretched into weeks, Daniel felt the line between his duty to his family and his sense of responsibility to the boys blur. He began to imagine a future for them that did not end in prison or the grave. He saw in them not criminals but recruits, not enemies but apprentices. His own past whispered that he could shape them, that he could take their raw energy and channel it into something stronger, cleaner, something that might save them from themselves. It was not an easy decision, and Catherine's resistance weighed heavily on him. She feared losing him to his own sense of obligation, feared the shadow of his old life creeping back into their home. But one evening when Daniel returned from the shelter and she saw the exhaustion in his eyes mixed with the faintest flicker of hope, she placed her hand over his and said nothing. It was not approval, but it was not rejection either. It was a silent acknowledgement that this was the man she had married, and that he could not turn away from a fight when he saw one worth fighting. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. One of the boys, smaller than the others, approached Daniel in the shelter's courtyard where he had been repairing a broken basketball hoop. The boy stood awkwardly, shifting from foot to foot, before finally asking if Daniel could show him how to throw a proper punch. It was a simple request, one that could have been a jest, but Daniel saw the earnestness in the boy's eyes. He nodded and began to demonstrate, correcting the stance, adjusting the angle of the arm. The others watched from a distance, pretending not to care, but curiosity drew them closer. That moment was the first crack in the wall they had built around themselves. It was the moment Daniel knew his path was set. He would not walk away. He could not. The faces of those boys had followed him from the parking lot to his dreams, and now they were becoming something else. Not just a memory of danger, but a promise of possibility. The world would have written them off as criminals in the making, but Daniel Harper had never believed in inevitability. He believed in discipline, in guidance, in the strength that came from direction. These boys were adrift, but he could anchor them. He had anchored himself once when the chaos of his past threatened to drown him. Now he would do it for them. The decision was final the night he returned from the shelter and looked into Lily's room before she slept. She was drawing at her desk, her small hands smudged with pencil lead, her face peaceful in the warm glow of the lamp. He realized that if those boys had someone, anyone, to watch over them as he watched over Lily, they might not have been in that parking lot at all. The line between his daughter and those boys blurred in that instant. Children were children, and it was circumstance that turned one into a victim and another into a threat. Daniel closed her door softly and turned to Catherine, who was watching him from the hallway. He told her, not with words but with the certainty in his eyes, that he had chosen his path. And though fear and doubt lingered in her, she nodded quietly, knowing that nothing could turn him away now. The truth he had discovered in the sterile rooms of the police station had changed everything. The boys were not his enemies but his responsibility. And in taking that responsibility upon himself, he was stepping into a new mission, one not given by commanders or governments, but by his own conscience. The parking lot had been the end of one story, but it was only the beginning of another. The decision had been made, though Daniel knew it would change the rhythm of his life and the lives of those closest to him. He could not forget the look in the eyes of the smallest boy who had asked him about throwing a punch. It had not been bravado, not even anger, but the tentative glimmer of trust, fragile and trembling, like the first spark coaxed into a flame. That spark demanded tending. The following weeks were marked by a routine unlike any Daniel had known in years. Each morning he saw Catherine off to her business appointments, walked Lily to school, and then made his way to the shelter where the boys were kept under the thin veil of supervision. At first the visits were short, nothing more than him standing at the edge of the courtyard as the boys smoked, argued, and sprawled on broken benches. They tested him with indifference, sneers, and the occasional cruel remark. He bore it without response, his presence steady, unyielding, like a rock that the tide might crash against but could never move. Slowly the hostility ebbed, curiosity taking its place. He brought a battered basketball one morning, rolling it across the cracked pavement without a word. They ignored it at first, but by the end of the day, two of them had begun to pass it between them, awkwardly, as if remembering something from childhood that had been buried under years of hunger and fear. That was the first lesson: consistency. Daniel returned day after day, showing them that he would not vanish as others had. He repaired what he could in the neglected shelter, the rusted hoop, a broken latch, a leaky faucet. They began to approach him, one at a time, under the guise of casual questions. Could he fix a pair of shoes? Did he know how to mend a ripped jacket? Each time he did so with patience, never asking for gratitude. Gratitude came anyway, silently, in the form of boys who lingered nearby rather than retreating to the safety of their scorn. Training began without ceremony. One afternoon, he found them restless, throwing punches at each other with wild, sloppy swings. He stepped between them, demonstrating a stance, correcting the position of the feet, the angle of the wrist. They laughed at first, but when one mimicked him and landed a punch with surprising control, the laughter shifted to something else: fascination. That was how it began. Each day thereafter, more joined in. Soon the courtyard became a makeshift training ground, the cracked pavement serving as their arena. Daniel drilled them in basics: balance, discipline, control. He taught them that power came not from anger but from precision, from knowing when not to strike as much as from knowing how to. It was exhausting, not physically. His body had been hardened by years of combat training, but emotionally. These boys were wounded creatures, their spirits battered by abandonment and neglect. They challenged him constantly, testing boundaries, pushing to see if he would give up. He did not. When one stormed off in a fit of rage, Daniel let him go, only to welcome him back the next day without reproach. When another tried to steal from him, Daniel caught him easily, handed the object back, and continued as though nothing had happened. In their world, adults either punished harshly or abandoned them. Daniel did neither. That confused them, and confusion became the soil in which trust took root. At home, the change was felt. Catherine remained cautious, her protective instincts wary of the danger she believed he was courting. Yet she watched the lines of strain in his face soften when he spoke of progress, and though she did not always voice it, she recognized the importance of what he was doing. Lily, with the openness only a child could possess, accepted the presence of the boys almost immediately. When Daniel began bringing a few of them by the house for short visits, she offered them her crayons, showed them her drawings, even shared her treasured stuffed rabbit for a moment before snatching it back with a giggle. For the boys, this glimpse of normal family life was both strange and magnetic. They had never been treated as welcome guests in anyone's home. The transformation did not happen all at once. Some of the boys resisted fiercely, clinging to the hardness that had kept them alive on the streets. One disappeared for several days, only to return battered from a fight, his pride broken along with his nose. Another tried to join an older gang, believing loyalty to Daniel was a weakness. But when that path nearly led to his death, he limped back, ashamed yet silently relieved to be accepted again. Daniel took them all back, no matter the stumbles, teaching them that discipline was not the absence of failure, but the persistence to rise after each fall. Weeks turned into months, and the training sessions grew more structured. Push-ups and sprints at dawn, drills in the courtyard, lessons on teamwork and strategy. Daniel pushed them not just to grow stronger, but to think differently, to see themselves as more than what the world had told them they were. He told them stories, not of glory or violence, but of resilience, of men who had learned to endure and to protect rather than destroy. He instilled in them the idea that they had something worth fighting for: each other. The first tangible victories came slowly. One of the older boys, once notorious for petty theft, accepted a referral from Daniel and began working in a mechanic's shop. He came back one evening, hands greasy, face tired but proud, showing the others the small wages he had earned. For the first time, the group saw that survival could mean more than scavenging or stealing. Another enlisted in the army, drawn by the promise of structure and belonging. The day he left, the others gathered awkwardly to see him off, their expressions a mixture of envy and pride. It was a moment Daniel would never forget, the birth of a new kind of loyalty, one not to gangs or survival, but to a shared hope. Still, setbacks remained. There were nights when Daniel feared he was losing them, when fights broke out among them or one disappeared back into the alleys. Each time he brought them back with patience, never with force. He taught them that weakness was not in asking for help, but in refusing it when offered. Slowly, they began to believe him. Catherine noticed the difference when a few of the boys began to treat Lily with the protective instinct of older brothers. They played with her gently, carried her on their shoulders, guarded her when she ran through the park. What had begun as suspicion on Catherine's part softened into cautious acceptance. She saw the way Daniel looked at them, not as burdens, but as something closer to sons. She saw, too, how they looked back at him, searching for approval with the hunger of children who had never known it. One evening, as the sun set and the last of the boys drifted back to the shelter, Daniel stood in the quiet courtyard, hands resting on his hips. The cracked pavement bore the marks of countless drills, their sweat staining the concrete like proof of transformation. He realized then that this was no longer an experiment or a temporary act of kindness. This was a mission, one that demanded every ounce of patience, strength, and resolve he possessed. He had once fought wars in distant lands, battles that blurred into each other with the passage of years. But here, in the heart of his own city, he had found the greatest battle of all, the fight to turn despair into hope, anger into discipline, enemies into family. As weeks turned to months and months hinted at years, Daniel knew the path would not be easy. Yet when he returned home and saw Catherine waiting with quiet resignation and Lily running to embrace him, he felt no doubt. This was the life he had chosen, the mission he had accepted. The boys were changing, and in guiding them, he too was being remade. The ghosts of his past had found a new purpose, and through them, he was building something stronger than any weapon or uniform could have given him. He was building a family, one forged not by blood, but by choice. Years passed, marked not by the swift and brutal rhythm of battles fought in foreign places, but by the quiet and persistent cadence of lives being reshaped day by day. The courtyard where it had all begun no longer echoed with the careless shouts of boys who knew only anger and hunger. It had become something else, a space filled with discipline, sweat, and the slow forging of character. Daniel Harper often stood at its edge, watching the transformation unfold, his hands resting behind his back, his posture still carrying the imprint of his military years. What had once been a scattered group of frightened, desperate teenagers now resembled young men with purpose, their bodies hardened, their eyes steady. For Daniel, the greatest measure of victory was not the number of push-ups they could complete, or the precision of their strikes, but the fact that some of them no longer returned to the shelter at night because they had places of their own to go. One had joined the army and written letters back, describing the strange comfort of wearing a uniform and belonging to something larger than himself. Another had found steady work at a mechanic's shop, his paychecks modest but enough to rent a small room and keep food on the table. A third was studying part-time, determined to finish the education he had abandoned years earlier when the streets became his only school. Daniel saw in these small triumphs the culmination of countless hours of patience, struggle, and trust. He had taught them to hold their fists steady, but more importantly, he had taught them to believe that their hands could build rather than destroy. Each success reinforced his conviction that the past did not have to dictate the future. And yet, for all the progress, he never allowed himself to forget the fragility of it all. Discipline was a habit easily broken, hope a flame easily extinguished if not protected. Catherine, once filled with hesitation, had come to see the boys as something more than a threat or burden. They had become familiar presences in her home, filling it with laughter and awkward attempts at politeness. She watched them tease Lily like older brothers, carrying her on their shoulders or showing her simple tricks they had learned in training. What had begun as suspicion transformed into acceptance and eventually into affection. She understood, as Daniel did, that family was not defined solely by blood, but by the willingness to stand together through hardship. Lily herself had grown alongside them. From a small girl clutching her stuffed rabbit in fear, she became a confident young girl who moved through the world with a certainty that came from knowing she was surrounded not by one protector, but by many. The boys treated her with reverence, not as a child to be coddled, but as someone who reminded them of the innocence they had once lost. For them, she became a symbol of the future they were working toward, a life where children could laugh without fear, where safety was not a dream but a reality. There were moments when Daniel would sit quietly in the evening, his gaze resting on the group gathered in his yard or in the modest training space they had claimed as their own. He saw their scars, both visible and invisible, and thought of the night in the parking garage when it had all begun. He remembered the weight of their weapons, the tremble in their hands, the hollow fear in their eyes. They had been enemies then, or so it had seemed, but now they were something closer to sons. He had fought wars under flags and commanders, but this silent transformation of broken children into men with futures was the greatest mission he had ever undertaken. Time brought its share of challenges. Some of the boys faltered, slipping back into old patterns. There were arrests, hospital visits, bitter nights when Daniel wondered if all his efforts had been in vain. But each time, he returned to them, steady and unwavering, offering not condemnation, but the chance to stand again. Slowly, they began to do the same for one another, catching each other when they stumbled, reinforcing the lessons he had taught them. They no longer needed him to hold them together. They were learning to hold each other. The most profound change came when those he had once saved began saving others. They returned to the shelters, not as frightened children, but as mentors, offering food, guidance, and the kind of firm compassion Daniel had shown them. They organized small groups, teaching younger boys the same lessons they had once learned on cracked pavement: balance, respect, endurance. What had started as Daniel's mission became theirs, a ripple spreading outward, touching lives he would never even meet. One evening, as twilight settled over the city and the air was filled with the scent of summer grass, Daniel sat in his modest backyard, watching as several of the young men sparred under the fading light. Lily, now taller, her hair tied back, sat nearby, sketching them with her usual quiet focus, while Catherine brought out a tray of iced tea. The scene was simple, domestic, yet for Daniel it carried the weight of triumph. These were not the boys who had once raised knives against his family. They were men now, some with jobs, some with families of their own, but all bound together by the second chance they had been given. As the sparring ended and laughter filled the air, Daniel leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a rare smile. The journey had been long and filled with uncertainty, but the result was undeniable. He had not destroyed his enemies that night in the parking lot. He had transformed them, and in doing so, he had transformed himself. He thought of his past, of the missions that had once defined him, of the men he had fought beside, and the shadows that still haunted his sleep. Those memories would never vanish, but they no longer controlled him. He had found a new battlefield, one where the weapons were patience and guidance, and the victories were measured in lives rebuilt rather than lives taken. Lily looked up from her sketchbook and smiled at him, her eyes filled with pride. Catherine sat beside him, her hand resting on his, her gaze soft with understanding. Around them, the voices of the young men he had once seen as threats blended into a chorus of belonging. In that moment, Daniel understood something profound. The greatest legacy a man could leave was not carved in medals or monuments, but in the lives of those he had lifted from despair to hope. The night deepened, and one by one the young men departed, promising to return, some bringing their own children next time, eager to introduce them to the man they called mentor. Daniel watched them go, the glow of the porch light casting long shadows across the grass. He knew the work was not finished, it never would be. But he also knew that the seeds he had planted had taken root, and from them a new forest would grow. As he stood to close the door and guide his family inside, Daniel glanced once more at the empty yard. He remembered the words that had come to him long ago, words forged in hardship and loss. The greatest victory was not to defeat an enemy, but to give him a reason to live. That truth had carried him through the darkest of nights, and now, in the quiet peace of his home, it filled him with a strength no battlefield had ever given. He had turned despair into discipline, fear into loyalty, enemies into sons. And in doing so, he had built a new family, one that would carry his lessons into a future brighter than any he had ever dared to imagine. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.